Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new segment on the Sumer Sports Show called The Class Play. On The Class Play, we'll take a wide-ranging view on what is most important in the upcoming draft, including high-level analysis on the draft itself, views into the 2024 draft class as a whole, and deep dives into the key faces to know going into draft day in April. Today's podcast happens just as workouts are about to begin in Indianapolis at the NFL Combine. And just as the Combine invites the top talent to come show what they've got, we'll be featuring top talent over the course of draft season on the Class Play. Today, we're bringing in five-star prospects with all-pro scouting grades, Tage, Seth, and Ben Brown. Tage has recently worked on an article that you can find live now on sumersports.com detailing which metrics matter long-term for each offensive position group in the Combine. But first, Tage, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Yeah, thanks for having me on your inaugural episode here. I'm pretty honored to be a part of it. I see that we have a lot of people in the live stream, so it should be a lot of fun. Hopefully we get some cool comments throughout the show.
Yeah, super excited. And also joining us is Ben Brown, former college football player. Ben, what's your favorite? I'm sure you're a 40 guy. Are you a 3-cone guy? Like, what are you killing it at?
Yeah, I mean, 3-cone definitely. I wish I was better at it. I do think that is the maybe more predictive stat. We can get into that with Tage in a little bit, but I was definitely more of a long distance guy. So 40 was the only place that I could really shine through. But thankfully, we got other metrics to measure that game speed nowadays, right? So.
Yeah, I'm sure that you are more of an in-game speed guy versus a 40 guy. Could you say that or no?
I would like to say I played faster than what I tested at, right? Which I think every person would probably say, but no, I think it's true. I mean, just the grit is an immeasurable thing, especially when it comes to 40-yard dashes versus game speed. So.
Great. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say the same for myself as a former walk-on. It always looked better on the field than in the test. But today our key topics are going to be focused on the following: what we can expect to see or not see at the Combine, how it's going to change the perception of the draft class long-term, and what we should glean from it at a high level. And so let's start with a key item. Obviously, Tage, you've looked at a lot of metrics per position. And one of the ones you honed in on really well was tight end. And with all the news going out about Brock Bowers, who, kind of around the Georgia blogs may or may not participate in the Combine, we'll see. We know that tight end is great at the Combine and really shows us a lot. So what are your kind of thoughts on where Brock Bowers will be, the latest on Brock Bowers, if he's in the Combine, what we should expect to see and or not see?
I do hope that Brock Bowers participates in the Combine. I know that there's been some mixed reports, around that, but I'm really hoping that he is the part of the Combine because the Combine is probably the most important of any position for tight ends in particular. When you look at some of the top tight ends in the league and their relative athletic scores, so you take all their Combine metrics, throw it into some sort of model or use different types of clustering and whatever method you want to use, you'll come to the conclusion that tight ends that are in the 90th percentile or greater are usually the tight ends that do well in the NFL. So, you look at George Kittle, who was a 9.29, Travis Kelce, 9.27, TJ Hockenson, 9.18, and then someone like Sam Laporta, who had a great season last year as a rookie, was a 9.02. So they're all 90th percentile or above, which is why you want to see Brock Bowers participate in the Combine, because as long as he checks that box, which I think that he should be able to, he's going to run the 40 really fast. We saw, he should be able to do some of the other drills really well at Georgia. Like, as long as he kind of meets all those thresholds, you can feel really good about taking him in the draft once he passes that cutoff there.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, Tage. I know that we've talked a lot about, positional versatility and things like that. Bowers is a guy who was even trusted really to run the ball at Georgia, and some of his comps as a result are outstanding, such as like George Kittle mixed with Deebo Samuel. Just on the tight end side, Dallas Clark, who was a former All-Pro. Some people just go completely outside of that and just call him a Mack truck and one of the best prospects in the draft. And so when you get some of those comparables coming in, obviously people would expect that person to be a very high draft pick. But Ben, can you give us kind of a view of, he is a tight end, and that market typically is a little depressed as compared to other markets. If you're a general manager going into the draft and you see kind of this once in a lifetime tight end product, blocking, running, catching, basically a full tool player, why would you kind of think twice about, drafting him really high?
Yeah, so great question. I think there's maybe like a really short answer and then the longer answer. I think the short answer, Kyle Pitts, I guess, might be the one reason to lean in the other direction. And I do think in some ways, like it's talked about quite frequently, but obviously just like the production of high end tight end draft picks in recent memory has been, I would say, relatively poor. And then on top of that, like, and this is kind of getting into more of like the salary cap implications, but the reality is like NFL teams operate in an environment where there's a hard cap on spending. And although there are, obviously ways of getting around it, the cap is, growing every single year. Like one of the biggest edges that, remains is deprioritizing positions that don't command, I would say, the higher percentage of your cap as much as like other positions. And there's like a surplus value that you gain hitting on a guy at a premium position at the top of the NFL draft that you're just not going to see from positions like tight end and running back. And then I think when you kind of fold back in the whole Kyle Pitts narrative and everything else, like there is a pretty substantial downside risk. Maybe not so much in Brock Bowers not necessarily developing, but like at what cost does he only end up as like a top 10 tight end and not necessarily the generational type prospect that we're talking about right now? And I think that's kind of the discussion that these NFL teams need to be having, and very much the reason why you could see, Brock Bowers potentially slide a little bit further than what everyone's kind of projecting him to be at right now from a pick standpoint.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the comps that I've kind of seen, obviously almost in the opposite direction, was Sam Laporta, who tested extremely well. And obviously, Tej, you're a big Lions fan. Like, what did you kind of see from the kind of Sam Laporta types versus, a Kyle Pitts, who was obviously projected to be way, way higher than Laporta ended up going? As a Lions fan, what did you think Laporta brought as a tight end? And do you think that they really saw the surplus value kind of have in taking him in the second round?
So the thing with Laporta that I think is really interesting, and that it really touches on the point that Ben brought up, is like, we are not good at identifying which tight ends are going to end up being good in the NFL. Like the athleticism stuff we talked about, like that plays a big role in the thing. But like being athletic solely doesn't mean that you're going to be a good tight end in the NFL. It's the good tight ends just happen to be really, really athletic. So when you look at Laporta in particular, he kind of sums up like the argument against taking these tight ends in the top, half of the first round, top 16 picks, because these athletic tight ends that have been drafted on day 2 usually have been the ones that have been successful for these teams when you look at Laporta from a surplus value perspective. And I know the Lions didn't necessarily take advantage of doing this in the first round, but like if you, in this draft in particular, if you want to take a tight end on day 2 or even early day 3 and pair that with a premium position in the first round, that could be a strategy that we see teams end up doing that need tight ends in this draft. And I think that Ben brought up so many good points with talking about Bowers in particular, where if you condition on all picks in the draft being good starters in the NFL, there's really not much of an argument against Bowers. Once you make that conditional statement, because he's going to give you surplus value on his second contract, because we know that tight ends aren't paid in a 1-to-1 for their receiving value compared to receivers. But you can't make that condition, right? Like tight ends just happen to be a position that has a flatter draft curve relative to other positions. So maybe that's why you'll see like the Chargers at 5 opt to take a Malik Neighbors, a Rome Odunze over a Brock Bowers, just because of that condition and maybe not having the full trust in their ability to hit on a tight end prospect.
Definitely. And I think you hit on something that is very interesting, is that, there's tight ends do a lot of stuff and we're not always great at evaluating them. There's a lot of other interesting products / probably a little bit more projects than a Brock Bowers would be. Obviously Brock Bowers is extremely, far along as a blocker, which is rare. We see that kind of aging curve come up that Eric has talked about quite a bit in articles over the years about how they age and improve, hit their peak a little later than other positions. I think Bowers probably has a lot of those tools, but a player like Jaheim Bell from Florida State or Jatavion Sanders from Texas are those players that would also interest you? And if you could kind of talk a little bit more about that aging curve and what you would expect to see, I'd love that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yes, to your point right away, I do think maybe slightly going back to Taja's point as well, like I do think the Lions in some ways are like the epitome of this discussion, right? Like drafting TJ Hawkinson as like a top 10 draft pick in some ways, like getting decent value from him, but maybe not like the revolutionary numbers that you needed to have him be at from a top 10 pick. And then moving on from him for a second round pick, and obviously kind of replacing him not one to one, but in a lot of ways with Sam Laporta, and kind of correcting that mistake. And I think that's got to be the reason why maybe waiting and not drafting Bowers in the top 10 makes so much sense from a team building standpoint. And kind of like you said, Sam, like I think there are a number of really intriguing later round guys to me, a guy that I think is like produced. Obviously his age is a little bit of a factor, but again, with our identification of tight ends and what's actually playing, right, I do think in some ways like a more seasoned person is at least going to give you better production right away. So I think a guy like Cade Stover, maybe in more close to like the third or fourth round could be, a decent spot to maybe gravitate away from using the top 10 draft pick at the tight end position, and could give you, I think, at least somewhat similar production from a standpoint of the first two seasons. Obviously, Brock Bowers could very easily, and the reason why we're having this conversation, blow him out of the water. But I think in a lot of scenarios or simulations, you would see those two at least gravitate more closer to the mean expectation than diverging as much as what their draft pick outcome is actually going to end up being here come April.
Yeah, I think that's great analysis. And, we've talked a lot about Sam Laporta here. Sam Laporta had an excellent combine. And Tage, you mentioned kind of his athleticism stories going in and coming out. We saw a pretty good rise on his EDP across mock drafts as a result of his performance in the combine. And so the next topic I'd kind of like to talk about is, where might what position groups we may, undervalue right now that, after this combine, we'll be really surprised about where they may project out to be. Tej, I know you talked a lot about the offense on Tuesday, but I think let's focus a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, we've seen people jump way up as a result of some of their combine scores. I mean, last year we saw Will McDonald. The Jets even wrote an article about how much they love some of his jumping scores at the combine, and we saw a median EDP rise of almost around 26 picks by my analysis. Ultimately, he ended up getting picked with the 15th pick, and then obviously, kind of the coup d'etat on this one is Travon Walker, who lit it up 4.51 40, 11 pick increase on his EDP, and then ultimately ended up getting picked with the first pick in that draft class. So Tej, is there any kind of people you're looking at the combine who may jump up just as a full class, and people that we may be surprised of kind of the value we may see post combine and going into April?
That's a really good question. I'm very excited for this combine as always, but I think someone that's going to make a jump a lot, maybe not as big of a jump as some of the guys that you mentioned there, but I think Xavier Worthy is going to be someone who makes a huge jump, this week in a lot of mock drafts after the combine is over, because I look at Worthy and I see some of the reasons why people are lower on him. The drops are an issue, which I think drops is more of an overrated receiver stat, but I think some people are pinning that on him. And then a limited route tree, I think, but that was more of, having A.D. Mitchell, having Jatavion Sanders and all the running backs that Texas had. I think that Steve Sarkisian, being one of the best offensive minds in college football, like just had a role built out for Worthy. But I think about how he's led Texas all 3 years in receiving yards. I think about the Red River shootout game, his freshman year, where he was just taking screens like to, as explosives and turning them into 15, 20 yard gains and touchdowns. And I think he's someone that's going to run a really fast 40 and then also do well at the other combine drills and make his athleticism score shoot up and be very high on teams' boards. Someone else I'm looking forward to seeing their combine this week is Jackson Powers Johnson, the center. I think that interior offensive linemen have a lot to prove when it comes to the 3-cone drill, the shuttle drill. And I think that he's someone that is pretty athletic overall, but maybe the technique and the finesse is not totally there yet. So as long as he tests well and he shows that he can be someone that can sustain that athleticism in the NFL, I think that'll be good. And Amarius Mims, I think, falls in that same bucket as offensive tackle, where he's someone that isn't polished yet, but should also test really well as well. And then you have to mention a quarterback here. So JJ McCarthy is the quarterback to watch at the combine, because I think that there's been some debates about his athleticism, like where he'll stack up when he gets to the NFL. Among all athletic quarterbacks, he's not like a pure mobile quarterback. Won't be anything close to like an Anthony Richardson combine performance last year, but I think he's someone that showed a decent amount of speed when running the ball at Michigan on design rushes and scrambles, and should be able to do pretty well in a lot of these combine drills also.
Tage coming in with the Go Blue Michigan homerism with the JJ McCarthy raising. I gotta love it, man. Obviously, I'm a Louisiana boy, and I'm pushing Jaden Daniels up to the top as much as I can. So I gotta love that. Honestly, some of my friends who are big fans of Michigan alum, also were highlighting in on some of the things, like they had a lot of big leads and other than garbage time, McCarthy has performed actually pretty well. And, I think that's the reason why we're seeing him rise. Also being in that pro style system that Jim Harbaugh runs. Obviously, Harbaugh's now with the Chargers. We've seen Andrew Luck be successful crossing over to the league. And so JJ McCarthy's definitely someone to watch. Ben, you've taken kind of a look a little bit at how kind of the combine and the changes after the combine can affect, how does this player look really long-term, not necessarily in terms of the draft, but in terms of like his complete career. What are your thoughts from that perspective?
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, what I've looked at, I would say relatively recently, and obviously this was like a quicker analysis, and I will have more content around it maybe, next week on sumersports.com, kind of like a post-combine evaluation of risers who could be rising, and also maybe what that expectation should be. But I think getting into it, like, it's been really difficult. And I think you personally kind of just mentioned a couple of people, but some of the biggest risers we've seen from the last 3 to 4 years have been really underwhelming, I would say, kind of across positions. Trayvon Walker's obviously kind of the poster child of that, but there have been, I would say, a number of other situations where we've seen from a pre-combine to post-combine, like EDP expectation, when that kind of does get out of whack, where that player is actually ended up getting drafted has been a really difficult task to, I would say, kind of live up to the draft expectation for that particular pick. And you can kind of do some things to arrive at an AV calculation based on Pro Football References data and align that with pick value. And you see that really there's only a handful of guys that I would say have performed kind of up to expectation when they have been, I would say, overdrafted based on some combine or maybe just like risers post combine. And that's kind of been like Brandon Ayuk, Antoine Winfield over the past 3 seasons. But we have seen, I would say, a ton of other misses. Like you said, Trayvon Walker, Will McDonald, even like Deontay Banks last year was a guy that rose really quickly, didn't really come to fruition in this rookie season. Louis Sign for the Vikings hasn't played whatsoever. Like a lot of these guys kind of sat in this like pick 60, pick 50 type range, ended up going in the latter half of the first round and have been in some ways haven't really lived up to that expectation. So I do think there's like a very cautious approach. We do see, just like from a correlation standpoint, it is at like a negative correlation when you do see dramatic rises pre to post combine. So I do think tempered expectations just based on where these guys' longer term outlook are going to be at if they do end up rising dramatically and then actually kind of getting drafted at that expectation, I think is maybe not necessarily the blessing that most people see it could potentially be. Yeah,
that's a great point, Ben. And I think especially given that the combine is really built around strength, speed, agility at those positions where all three of those things are key rather than some, the softer skills or the harder skills to evaluate, like kind of these big man positions. There may be kind of a bias when we see the combine. We see these crazy numbers, especially because we can't really measure the hand placement of an offensive lineman in any type of automated way that really requires the expertise of scouts and things like that. And sometimes it just comes down to heart or effort or these other things, and that we at Sumer Scout are very honed in on and very excited to kind of bring to the forefront, as well as kind of these analytics and numbers. And talking about those big men, one of the parts of this draft class that I'm most excited about is this interior defensive line class. I think they're a little unheralded, and you may not know some of the names yet, but I think as this combine comes about, you're going to get to see some of that strength, some of that agility, some of that speed of these players that are all, pretty big and have a pretty good skill set. And so, Tej, you've kind of done a look at the interior defensive line class. What are your thoughts?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because I do really think that the interior defensive line class is underrated, in this year's draft class. And I think that, as people have more time to dive into everything, like they'll start to see, and it really starts, with, I think there's probably a clear top two, and that's Jazon Newton from Illinois and Byron Murphy from Texas. And I think both of them are really good players that are going to be able to fill roles where, we've seen defensive tackle positional value rise in these past couple of years with the increase in teams playing too high safeties and lighter boxes. Like, I think there are types of players that will fit in those schemes lightly, but then you have some underrated players in this class that can play interior defensive line. Tavondre Sweat, Chris Jenkins, even if you go deeper into like day three or maybe day two, day three prospects, like Mason Smith was someone who, was playing on an LSU defense last year that was missing corners the entire season. And like, I think he has gotten unfairly dinged for that. He was someone that was thought of pretty highly coming into the season. And because of the kind of like the state of the defense that he was playing on, I think he got knocked down a little bit, but like he could be someone that you throw a late round dart throw at. Braden Fisk from Florida State, like, again, is someone who you can throw a late round dart throw at. So I think that there's a lot of good options at interior defensive line.
Yeah, and you kind of hit the nail on the head talking about Mason Smith there too. Kind of on both ends of the spectrum. I'm really excited about Johnny Newton in this draft. I've watched a lot of film and highlights of him. I think he has great hands. He can rush from multiple different places. I think he's really positionally versatile. And I think as we kind of move forward in offensive football, I'd love to see someone like Johnny Newton, succeed at 3-tech, 1-tech, nose guard, maybe even play a little 5-tech. I mean, we saw that in the Super Bowl, how disruptive Chris Jones was. And obviously we've seen guys like Aaron Donald play like that before. I'm excited for these kind of guys that have a really diverse skill set as the scheme across the offensive and defensive fronts come up. And so we have a question here talking about Byron Murphy. Ben, do you want to double up on Byron Murphy for the Vikes D?
I mean, I definitely don't hate it, I would say, at this point in time. I do think, obviously, like, specifically for the Vikings, like their secondary situation has been completely up in arms. Like, what happens with Harrison Smith is only going to leave a further void. So I do think just like, in some ways locking that in and figuring things out, I think is probably the best case option. But I guess you're talking about Byron Murphy, Texas defense tackle, Byron Murphy. So I think in some ways, like, going back to it, I don't really love it as like a late first round draft pick. I do think in some ways, if we can get him later on, it might be a decent fit for us. But I think overall, I think in some ways, like, the Vikings have a lot of question marks defensively, who can fit in Brian Flores' scheme, but I do think it maybe makes some sense to go in that direction for sure later on in the draft.
Yeah, and I think, kind of to my earlier point, Brian Flores, with all that pressure that he brings, all the blitzes, things coming out of nowhere, I'd love to see someone like Byron Murphy or some of these great interior defensive linemen on that Vikings squad. So moving on, as we kind of come to a close here at the class play, we're always going to try to do something a little fun. talk about some interesting historicals, talk about some draft class. And so today I just want to bring up who, Tej and Ben, are your favorite running back prospects. Maybe not necessarily because he had a crazy combine or because he had, a ton of production historically, but who are your favorite running back prospects looking back over the years? Start with you, Ben.
Yeah, so I think, going back to my Vikings fandom a little bit, this was one that hit really close to home, but it was post Robert Smith, like dramatically retiring, in a similar vein to what Barry Sanders did to Tage's Detroit Lions. And the Vikings panicked basically and went up and drafted a workout warrior called Michael Bennett, also a duplicate name in NFL circles basically later on with defensive end Michael Bennett from the Seattle Seahawks. But no, running back Michael Bennett, I think he was maybe, I don't know if this is a factor or not, but I do think Ron Dane and Michael Bennett were the first like thunder and lightning duo at the college football level. I'm not quite sure if that's actually true or not, but Michael Bennett was very much the lightning, ran a blazing fast 40-yard time, ended up as a first-round draft pick, and was actually really productive as a rookie before kind of bottoming out after that rookie season and not really doing anything whatsoever. But I do think, at least from like a running back standpoint, because it was my Minnesota Vikings, he was by far like the most excited I've ever been, because that was very much a spot where I thought running backs not only set the table for your offense, but were really like the engine that made everything go. So I think that was the most excited I've ever been for a running back draft prospect. And unfortunately, it didn't live up to the hype after year one.
That's a deep cut, Ben, and I'd appreciate nothing else from you. Tej, what about you?
So I have a couple. I love Ben's answer there. One of them for me was Christian McCaffrey, just because like those Stanford teams were so much fun, and like that last memory you had of him going up against Iowa in the Rose Bowl, where he had a receiving touchdown, a punt return touchdown, and I think he was also breaking off some pretty long rushes, just like all in the first half. Like that game was over in the first half, and it was a large part because of Christian McCaffrey, and went off to have a pretty good NFL career, I would say. But another one was DeAnthony Thomas, from Oregon, where like I guess he was like kind of a hybrid running back wide receiver, but like his speed was insane in college, and I really thought that he was going to be like awesome in the NFL. Didn't work out as nicely for him, but like it was great to watch him in college, and I was definitely obsessed with him when I was in I think it was middle school probably. Like I was watching his highlights when we got computer lab time for sure.
Awesome. Yeah. So we're building teams here. Ben has Michael Bennett, the workout warrior. I love that pick. Tej has added two. He's added Christian McCaffrey and DeAnthony Thomas. A lot of speed there, some jet sweeps going on. I'm going to add to my team Reggie Bush. As a Saints fan, Reggie Bush was video game mode at the NCAA level. Everyone thought he was going to go first. Obviously, on a more kind of emotional, personal side, that was after the hurricanes in South Louisiana. And I just remember at the time, as a young kid, it was impeccable that we were bringing in, this godlike figure in Reggie Bush, absolute NCAA legend. Obviously helped us win a Super Bowl and helped us get to an NFC Championship game. Obviously had that fantastic run against the Bears in that NFC Championship game where kind of taunted the Bears after 80 yards down. And then after that, the Bears kind of ran away with the game. Punt returns, one of the first kind of scat back, pass catching wide receivers. And I think we've seen Alvin Kamara kind of turn into the perfect example of what Reggie Bush could have been. A guy before his time. And I think if I went back and drafted Reggie Bush, probably not at 2, but probably a little bit later, given what we know now, to a team like the Saints or a team in 2024, I think he'd have a massive impact. Maybe kind of like Jahmyr Gibbs did, maybe a little bit for the Lions. Tej, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I think that there's certain players where like you'd want to see them in today's NFL, and I definitely think that's one of them. Where it's like it'd be really cool to see them in their prime with how the league looks right now.
Definitely. Well, Tej and Ben, I definitely appreciate you joining me today. I think we got into some deep cuts and really helped the audience kind of know what's coming up in the combine and keep an eye out for a few key players. and obviously a little history too in terms of the running backs. So this has been the Class Play. I appreciate everyone for joining. Make sure to subscribe if you're on YouTube or Apple Podcast or Spotify. And follow along on SoomerSports.com. You can read a lot of the insights that were talked about in this podcast. Tej wrote about on SoomerSports.com, and Ben and I will be writing articles on there shortly. A lot of hard work going on there. And so please continue to follow along, and we appreciate you coming. Thank you.